Joining me now is Andy No. He is the editor-at-large of the Post Millennial, as well as the author of the book Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. Andy, thanks so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Now, your book is being released on February 2nd, and you are the perfect person to have written this book because you have been covering Antifa for years now. Whenever your name comes up or when I think about you, I always think of that iconic photo of you back in 2019 when you were actually attacked by Antifa. You had milkshake dripping down your face, you had cuts and bruises all over your face. Something I was always curious about with Antifa was sort of the leadership structure. So let's start there. Can you give us an inside look into what Antifa's leadership looks like?
Yeah, so what makes Antifa so effective and actually difficult to counter is that they are made up of networks of decentralized and autonomously run organizations. They do communicate with one each other through social media, through encrypted chat channels, but for the most part, they operate regionally and independently from one another. So that makes dismantling them very difficult. Um, but not impossible to challenge. I mean, I think an analogous extremist ideology and movement you can compare them to are cells of jihadists, for example, people who may or may not belong to the same organization, but share similar ideology and are willing to use violence to further their political agenda.
Back in September, then nominee Joe Biden said that Antifa was an idea rather than an organization. And he was actually referencing comments that the FBI director had made earlier that month. He had told lawmakers that Antifa is an ideology or a movement, not an organization. What do you make of that? And from your own experience reporting on the ground, how would you evaluate what Antifa is?
Christopher Wray, the FBI director, wasn't necessarily wrong, but his comments weren't the full picture. He should have followed up that statement by saying there may not be a Antifa organization, as in a single one, but actually many of them who operate under a number of different names, who are connected to networks that operate nationally and transnationally. But I think the issue, the criticism that I had for Biden and Christopher Wray and many other people do is by describing it merely as an ideology does underplay and downplay the threat that they pose. I need to remind viewers who are watching this that Antifa haven't just wreaked like hooligan violence on the streets of American cities. They've actually have claimed territory, such as when they took over an area of downtown in Seattle in 2020. They did the same thing in December in Portland. And these areas led to extreme violence, homicides, shootings.
In relation to President Biden now, he is officially in office. What do you anticipate Antifa will look like under the Biden administration? And, in regards to their plan to destroy democracy, what do you think that will look like under this new administration?
Great question, Samantha. So, Antifa, some people perceive them to be a movement that is closely allied or connected to the Democrat Party, and that's a misconception. It's actually incorrect. So, since it was known in November that Biden had won the election, there have been around a dozen riots in the Pacific Northwest. And the Pacific Northwest is particularly where they are most active, Portland and Seattle, but some places on the East Coast as well. And so they are not Biden fans, they're not Democrat fans. I think they allied themselves with Democrats, and Democrats kind of indirectly were coddling them because they saw, or rather, they used and exploited the Trump administration and the fears around it as an excuse to empower themselves. So that going back to 2016, that was how Antifa really shot up and became a really growing phenomenon because Democrats and liberal journalists and biased professionals in academia and other important institutions were excusing Antifa's violence because they actually believe that Trump was the sign of ascendant American fascism. Of course, that was always a pretext and just an excuse. And now with Trump no longer in office, I think Antifa is still going to further their political agenda of destabilizing local governments, which they've been able to do with quite success in Portland. I mean, the mayor of Portland, who under his watch, he allowed his city to become the epicenter of their organizing. They've assaulted him, they hunt him down, they look for him, they've rioted outside his home, they've forced him from his home. So our leaders, actually, our Democrat leaders, are living in fear because of this beast that they have fed and have allowed to grow. And now I think it's really too late to slay it. We're only early in 2021, and we've had some pretty significant rioting by Antifa so far.
Do you think that Antifa will eventually dissolve, or do you think it will continue operating the way it currently does?
I think they will continue to find success in what they do best, which is causing misery for the public by looting, by destroying property, by killing, by injuring and hurting people. And in terms of what it would take to stop them, all it takes is really for us to enforce the laws that are on the book, but that takes political will, and we don't have that political will, unfortunately, in some major urban areas, such as Portland, Seattle, and some other places, because Antifa and their sister ally, I would call BLM, cloak themselves under the banner of fighting for racial justice, fighting against white supremacy, fighting against fascism. And so we've been made to believe by a biased media that if you oppose BLM, if you oppose Antifa based on their ideology and their actions, that somehow that makes you pro-fascism or against racial equality. And unfortunately, Democrats have really empowered those type of rules that now all of us are subject to. I mean, I myself, who's been a victim of Antifa violence, has been smeared viciously by people in the mainstream left as a fascist propagandist.
I just want to talk a little bit more about the media's role in covering Antifa. Where do you think it went wrong with its coverage, and how, as someone who's part of the media, can we do better in order to cover Antifa in a fair but accurate way?
I think Daily Caller has done an amazing job because they're one of the very few outlets, and you guys are small outlets, and you've been able to really have put the resources into putting feet on the ground into these areas where the riots have happened. And some of your staff have been injured as a result. That takes a lot. That type of work is extremely hard to do. I mean, I was beaten in the course of doing riot coverage in 2019. There's been other journalists who are from legacy media in local broadcast stations, and their journalists have been assaulted, and so they just don't go in and cover it anymore. So it has become difficult for people to get an accurate picture. I think really it comes down to our papers of records like the New York Times and the Washington Post having the courage to report accurately on this violent extremist movement and the threat that they pose to civil society, our norms, nonviolence. But unfortunately, I've been attacked by some reporters who are associated with some of these publications for my critical analysis of Antifa. So, that's a big wish for hoping that they come around. But I think people need to support independent media. They need to support Daily Caller, and because there's very few who are doing what you guys are doing.
Something that I thought was interesting, and I hope that you can talk a little bit more about this. I'm not sure if you touch upon it in your book, but sort of the psychological cause for these people on both sides of the political spectrum turning to violence, turning to political violence, whether it's burning down a building or storming the Capitol. What causes Antifa to do this? What caused the rioters on January 6th to do that?
So I'll talk about Antifa first, since that's what I'm most familiar with. So my hometown of Portland, Oregon, is where the most violence happened. For more than 5 months, there were nightly riots happening, and a lot of it was centered around attacks on the federal courthouse in downtown. So when I saw what happened on the 6th of January, of course, I immediately condemned that because these actions carried out by those rioters mirrored what I experienced and saw in my city last year. But the response from Democrats and other elected officials, um, I just wonder why they were silent when Antifa did all that and worse last year, because most of them, all of them really, were at best silent, and at worst, some of them were actually encouraging people to donate to some of these crowdfunding campaigns that were aiding accused rioters who have been arrested. Um, I think the psychology behind it comes from well, in the book, I write about how the Antifa members are radicalized. I've been leaked documents by somebody who went through the membership process for Rose City Antifa, and these are published for the first time in the book. And you'll see that there's a curriculum that introduces people to extreme literature incrementally and brainwashes them. And so when Antifa carry out acts of terrorism, such as bringing guns, knives, explosives, starting fires, trying to hurt and kill people, they actually think that they are doing it for not just a good cause, but like the just and most noble thing that you could do. They really view the US and law enforcement as uh, fascists or people who empower fascism, and therefore they need to be crushed. And so when they talk about how they do what they do by any means, whatever it takes and by any means necessary, they believe it. So, and that's what makes them so dangerous, because they have no, their ideology does not have any ability to moderate. If anything, it only goes further and further, which is why some of them have killed for their cause, or they celebrate murder as well. And I think in terms of when I have read and listened to people who have expressed support or sympathy for the riot that happened on Capitol Hill, one argument that I'm hearing a lot is they say something along the lines of, well, BLM and Antifa were given the space to riot and carry out their political grievances through direct action throughout 2020, months on end. Why can't we do it then? So this is the thing about Antifa's violence, is they're not just radicalizing, I guess, one another, but they're causing counter reactionary movements as well. People who see that Antifa are able to carry out violence with impunity, and they either want to do the same or create their own vigilante type response to it. All of this has an effect of weakening the rule of law and law enforcement institutions.
Now, speaking of law enforcement, after the January 6th riot happened, there were checkpoints, there was high security, you saw it on television. What do you make of the response to the January 6th riot versus what we saw over the summer?
So all the thousands of troops that were sent to the streets of DC for Inauguration Day, and that's where they set up these checkpoints and these really tall barriers, um, they should have been sent to Seattle and Portland instead, because violence on Inauguration Day by Trump supporters didn't happen. There wasn't even any attempt for that to happen. But instead, what happened in Seattle and Portland is that Antifa, advertising weeks in advance of Inauguration Day, took to the streets and burnt things, shut down traffic, assaulted people, shattered multiple businesses, which is what they do routinely now. So that disparate response, I notice it. I think with, I mean, I'm not particularly hopeful that the Biden administration will use federal law enforcement when needed to quell left-wing political violence, because people on the extreme far left are saying that they're doing what they're doing for racial justice, for social justice, and Democrat politicians and others are deathly afraid of being accused of countering that.
Well, Andy, no, I so appreciate you coming on to talk about your new book that's being released February 2nd, Unmasked: Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. I'd love to have you back on for another interview to talk about more of your reporting about Antifa. So thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thank you.